Ladies and gentlemen, The Conquest of the Material World, Essays on the Coming of Industrialism, edited by John U. Neff. Excellent book. I haven't read much of it, but virtually every damn sentence in the opening bit here is worth it. So we're going to start off here, The first chapter is called Mining and Metallurgy in Medieval Society. Now it opens by saying that, quote, nature endowed Europe with extraordinarily varied and abundant mineral resources, end quote. That's not true. Nature endowed this entire frickin' planet with abundant resources. Anywhere on the planet you go, you will find abundant natural resources. Some places slightly more than others, but natural resources in themselves do not make wealth. And it's a sad attitude by this academic here that they do. Europe was not endowed with a bunch of wealth. Every place on the planet was endowed with wealth. What Europe was endowed with, or achieved, was liberty. That's what made the difference. But, continuing, he says that the conquest of this underground wealth by the Western people has been inseparable from the unprecedented power obtained by men in recent centuries over the physical world. True. This power over the physical world has come from the solution of technical problems which earlier civilizations had never seriously faced. Many of these problems first became acute in connection with what? War? No, good guess. Building cities, maybe? No. Oh, it's an okay guess. No. Mining and metalworking. He says a lot of what we call the Industrial Revolution came about because of problems faced with mining and metalworking. Quote, 3 examples will perhaps suffice. It was the search for adequate means of draining coal pits that led to the practical use of the force contained in jets of steam to the invention of the steam engine. Now, I pause there for a second. You may not know the history of the steam engine. I'll just say a couple words on it. The first steam engines were 4 or 5 stories tall. They worked at 3 or 4 pounds per square inch. Very, very low pressure. They didn't move. They were stationary houses. They pumped water. That's what they're originally for. There's all these coal mines in Britain which are down below the water table, and there were coal seams that were out underneath the ocean. And some mines went out a mile or 2 underneath the ocean. And that was just completely out of the question before they had the ability to pump water in massive, massive quantities. So all of this coal became available because of the invention of the steam engine and solving this. And in some of these early mines, 30 or 40% of the coal that they produced went right into their steam engine to pump the water out of the mine for the other 50 or 60%. Now, you've probably heard of the Athabasca tar sands, and I don't think Athabasca is the right word. Anyways, up there in Canada, all that tar sand that they have to burn 1 barrel of oil for every 2 barrels that they're able to actually ship out somewhere, because they have to superheat the stuff, and you have to separate it from the sand, and it takes a lot of energy. So they're burning 33% of the energy that comes up out of the ground, and only 60% or so actually makes it to society. That is it's more efficient than these early steam engines and the coal mines. Now, today people are going off their rocker. They're just going completely insane at the fact that a barrel of oil has to be burned to get 2 barrels of oil to society. And they're like, oh my God, we're burning up our resources just trying to get resources. This is an old story. It'll get more efficient. And if it doesn't, what the hell? We've got a 300-year deposit of oil up there. Just at the current rate that we're using it, we'll have 300 years just from that area, let alone Saudi Arabia and Siberia and every place else. So It's an old story to burn up massive quantities of resources to get the balance out to society, and we'll be fine. Just like we didn't run out of coal and the world didn't end because they were burning so much coal to pump water, we'll be fine. Now, as the quote, as the quantities of materials dug out of the earth increased, their bulky character exerted increasing pressure on men's minds to discover cheaper methods of carrying them over land and water. Right, so step one, we got to pump the water out. Okay, we get the water pumped out. Now we've got all this coal. We got more coal available than ever. Now, step two, what do we do with this coal? How do we get it from here to there? You'll be interested, perhaps if you're interested in the video we're doing now, you'll be interested in my video called Railroads Before Canals. Pardon me, Canals Before Railroads. It's a two-part video, brilliant little video about how canals were a major form of transportation and were done away with only after a fight and only after railroads were invented. But, continuing. So they now need cheaper ways of carrying the massive amounts of stuff they're able to produce. It was the difficulty of hauling ore and coal in wagons along rough, soggy ground that led to the invention and development of the railway. Now, a railroad originally meant a road with rails, which is still what it means, but the railroad didn't come all in a piece with steam engines and trains and everything. It was soggy, unpaved roads were a problem, and they laid down wooden rails and had carts that you pushed on the wooden rails and stuff, and they had horse-drawn ore carts and stuff long before they ever hitched an engine of any kind up to any of it. So Europe's got this abundant coal and iron ore, and they're learning how to pump the mines dry, and they're developing ways to move it about. Upon this abundance, the great industrial expansion of modern times partly depended. Had it not been for cheap iron and steel, the 20th century Europe might be giving his fiancée an iron ring as a token of their engagement. As Pliny tells us was still the custom in rich Roman world of the first century, iron was a precious metal before it became an abundant metal. An iron wedding ring. Isn't that interesting? Iron was a metal to be traded in. It was a form of money. In fact, the Spartans only allowed iron currency in their countries. Iron ingots, chunks of iron, not necessarily coins, but chunks of it in uniformly shaped ways that could be used for metalworking. But iron is a brilliant material, but it used to be a precious metal. Iron wedding rings, valuable enough for that. Had it not been for the general use of coal fuel, which was no less novel than the production of large quantities of iron, the expansion of heavy industry could hardly have taken place. Now, pause there for a second, because it turns out that back in the 1200s, massive seams of coal and iron were developed and exploited in China. And it's not true, as he says right here, that the general use of coal and large quantities of iron were what it was all about. That's not true. Actually, the reason it took off in Britain is because John Locke and Isaac Newton together, well, not together, but in a certain sense, conspired historically to produce a monetary economy, an economy based on specie. David Harriman, I think, maybe it's not Harriman, an objectivist points this out, that, or it's in Salzman, I think, Salzman's book about gold and liberty, that massive iron deposits and coal deposits are here and there throughout the world, but the Industrial Revolution started on this small island because they developed an economy of hard currency. They had reliable gold currency. So that's one of the very, very important roots of the Industrial Revolution, was an economy based on specie. and this economy based on specie, what was the root of it? Philosophy, ideas, because John Locke and Isaac Newton knew that it was important to have a currency that wasn't constantly being debased by the crown, and they knew that that was just part of an objective, honest way of dealing with other humans, and therefore moral. They didn't necessarily know it was going to lead to the Industrial Revolution, but they knew on logical and rational grounds that the deception and theft, which was debasement of currency, shouldn't be allowed to occur. So when that was finally done away with, it gave this economy the foothold to develop what became the Industrial Revolution. Now, we skip a bit down to a section called The Industries in Classical Times. And it talks about all the abundance of ore and stuff in Europe. Quote, at hundreds of places in Europe, seams of ore containing gold, silver, copper, lead, and zinc, tin, and iron, as well as seams of coal, once broke through the surface or lay hidden at such short depths that builders uncovered them while digging foundations, if they had not already been disclosed by the plow of some husbandman. Now, this is an interesting point, and he mentioned it a little earlier, that the use of coal was one of the things that led to the Industrial Revolution. One of the reasons they quit using wood and started looking for other more energy-abundant materials, they weren't at first looking for more energy-abundant materials. It's just that wood was becoming so rare. They had deforested large portions of Europe. And even where there were forests, they were too far away from cities or towns to be useful. So wood is nice. A higher form of energy can be made from wood called charcoal, a higher energy content. But that takes wood. And so coal was one of the things that they came to use, coal and peat moss and stuff, because of a lack of wood. And additionally, the reason they started sinking these shafts and stuff and mining underground is because all of the top ground stuff had been exploited, was gone. Now it mentions here the silver mines at Laurium. There was silver-bearing lead ore near Athens, and so it mentions that 500 years before Christ was born, there were already these underground shafts that went down hundreds of feet. But that's an exception to the rule. That was a very, very productive society. They were slaves that were working in there. But it was a society that could use the ore. So it took another 1,500 plus years, or 2,000 years, for these ores and minerals to get rare enough that sinking large pits was being used all across Europe. So the Greeks were first, again. Quote, during the Hellenistic period, which is Alexander the Great and after him, mining operations were pursued with increased vigor in some of the lands surrounding the Mediterranean, so that the Romans found metallurgical enterprises in nearly all the countries they conquered. That's an interesting thought. I mean, it's not a surprise or shock to me. It's just further evidence that Rome inherited civilization. We give Rome a lot of credit for a lot of stuff, and a lot of the stuff we give them credit for came from the Greeks, including the metallurgical works all around the Mediterranean basin, not just in Greece itself, but from the rocks of Gibraltar up to the Black Sea and Russia and down into Egypt. Metallurgy was an enterprise the Greeks had in full force before Rome ever came into its own. Now here's an interesting tidbit. Quote, like the Greeks, the Romans generally had little scientific knowledge of the nature of minerals. Many well-educated men thought that they grew like plants, a view which persisted even among the intelligentsia in Europe into the 18th century. In 1709, the French intendant at Lyons actually consoled the Contrôleur General for the exhaustion of the surface coal at Saint Etienne. by telling him that these mines had the happy property of reproducing themselves. So he said, yes, you've gotten all the easy coal, the coal mines worked out, it's played out, but it's okay, don't worry, because it's like chopping down a forest, you know, the forest will grow back, the coal will come back, don't worry. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Just when mankind in ancient Greece and Rome, just when they start to develop towards what might become the Industrial Revolution, out comes the very unfortunate attitude that natural is better than man-made, and that man-made tinkering and stuff is bad in some way, which the modern environmentalists are just the latest carbon copy of this. But, quote, in classical times, mining was generally regarded as a much less desirable occupation than agriculture. A law was passed by the Roman Republic, probably towards the end of the 2nd century BC, prohibiting the digging of ore in Italy. Wow, right? Modern authorities disagree about the circumstances that led to this enactment. It seems to reflect the distaste felt by classical peoples for labor underground and their preference for agrarian pursuits. Now, they locked themselves out of the future of what was to be the Industrial Revolution. Who knows? Maybe it could have occurred back then. Not likely. Very doubtful. But they certainly cost mankind quite a lot of comforts and stuff. I mean, productivity and resources are just that. It's productivity and resources. And to prohibit the production of resources can only have harmed mankind. And to prohibit it because farming's a better... It's crazy. Now, it mentions here the fact that the easy-to-work seams were disappearing in Roman times, and it was taking more and more labor to get to the ore that existed, and the price of ore was going up, therefore. Now, this could have, should have, would have led to more progress in getting these ores and finding them and exploiting them and using them, but for the collapse of civilization, which always puts a damper on things. Quote, to a modern man who has visited the coalfields of Belgium, South Wales, or Pennsylvania, with the mountains of black earth beside the shaft, or who has seen the skies aflame for miles from the fires of blast furnaces in the Ruhr, the English Midlands, or northwest Indiana, the mines and forges of the Roman Empire would not have seemed impressive. Together with the quarries, they formed merely small islands in a sea of fields and meadows. Now that last sentence there is a quote from The Social and Economic History of the Roman Empire by Rostovtsev, Rostovtzeff, if you're interested to know more about ancient Rome and so on. According to the criteria of a modern European, all metals were scarce. So the way that we look at it, like I was saying earlier, iron was a precious metal. Metal was the material of many statues, but it was never the basis for constructing ships, aqueducts, public buildings, theaters, or stadiums. Now, I've mentioned this in another video series somewhere. Metal was used for art. And you ask yourself, come on, you say, couldn't you have figured out, to use the bronze to make knives or something? The very first metal that we've ever found, copper and stuff, was made into ornaments. But you don't use the most valuable and transfixing object you have available to you for mundane uses like a plow. We don't make a plow out of titanium, and you use metal for extremely valuable and, it turns out, not very utilitarian purposes, like art objects. Quote, metal was used as sparingly as possible in making tools and machinery. Iron was almost always obtained by prolonged and patient heating in a forge fire, followed by reiterated heatings and hammerings on the anvil. Small-scale operations alone were possible, and much of the iron present in the ore was lost as slag and scale. The process was very costly in firewood, charcoal, and labor. Now, to go back to that previous sentence there, much of the iron present in the ore was lost in slag and scale. Actually, during World War II, huge mounds of iron slag in Italy were reprocessed by Mussolini, and the ore was used. So that was like a very inefficient, in the ancient times, as efficient as they can make it, and turned out to be a deposit for the future. Now, if mankind ever gets to a situation where we're seriously, where the environmentalists say we're running out of everything, they have the Malthusian attitude. If it ever does get that bad, we can dig up our, landfills. Our landfills are full of plastic, for example, which we could turn into other plastic and stuff as a petroleum product, and full of metals and stuff, all kinds of resources in it. So, just like the Italians recycled Roman slag heaps, in the future we can recycle our buried trash. It's not uselessly buried forever, so don't worry about throwing things in the damn landfill. Get on with it. Now, you know the difference between lead and iron. Lead is quite soft and very heavy, as well as poisonous, but they didn't know that back then, compared to iron. Quote, lead was preferred to iron whenever it could serve, because less fuel was needed to produce it. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. They had deforested the continent in trying to get fuel, and that's what brought coal and peat moss into use. We skip down a little bit. As the price of wood rose under the pressure of the growing population and expanding industry, metallurgy and every other kind of manufacture requiring fuel was discouraged. Right? It put a damper on things, the lack of wood. Without the wholesale use of coal, oil, and hydroelectric power, not hydroelectric dams, but you can think of water mills in the ancient world. But without coal, oil, and hydroelectric power, and the preliminary use of abundant wood from the thick forests of northern Europe and America, industrial changes similar to those which transformed the West would be impossible. And this is something that really irks me about people that want us to stop using oil or use less oil, and they're tearing their hair out of fear for peak oil. It is such an abundant energy source that if we stop using it, we're going to lose large portions of what we consider to be modern life. It's not simply just put up solar panels and windmills and hydroelectric dams. We've got such a massive need for the energy produced from oil that it is unthinkable to stop using it and leave it in the ground, which is what these complete ignoramuses and morons want to have happen. It would be a tragedy. All right. Now the next section, the course of production circa 300 to 1330.